Welcome to Realms Unknown, a sci-fi and fantasy podcast brought to you by the Bugle. Incoming communication from the hostile battleship. The crew lunged towards action stations on the space deck of HMAS Star Trek. First Class Second Lieutenant Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games swung into her navigational deck chair, nodding brusquely at Timothor Shalimar, who was Timothy Chalamet but a Klingon, who pressed the intercom button to commence communication with the large hostile ship whose largeness filled the view out their front window. Evil Rory Gilmore filled the screen, sporting a sinister, sexy goatee to indicate evilness. I'm having one of those moments where everything is so perfect you almost feel sad that nothing can ever be this good again. At last, my evil plan has come to fruition. Wait a minute, where are Kirk and Spock? I wanted revenge on Kirk and Spock. I was promised Kirk and Spock. Katniss Everdeen interrupted Timothor. Captain Kirk is off making out with Dr. Spock, the children's author, and Lieutenant Commander Spock had to be relieved of duty because he took Vulcan rationality too far and started a podcast about effective altruism. He was last seen trying to get VC funding for a Mars mission entirely manned by AI tradwife sexbots. Evil Rory Gilmore clenched her delicate feminine fist. Foiled again. This is what happens when you come up against Realms Unknown. Yes, that's right. You've just entered Realms Unknown, a weekly speculative fiction podcast brought to you by The Bugle, in which we discuss science fiction and fantasy tropes, the newest news, our favorite old shows, books, games, and more. I'm your host, published author and comedian Alice Fraser, and my companion on this journey, the sentient robot Darcy to my steampunk inventrix Elizabeth Bennet, the sexy Hulk to my wounded and needy Tony Stark, the Edward and Jacob in bed with each other to my Empreg Sherlock and Holmes in a long-term domestic arrangement. It's me. That's right, it's a solo episode. I am being my own better half, and our subgenre deep dive for the day will be fan fiction, the ways in which works draw from and pay tribute to other works, with more or less attribution. But before we get into that, let's have a look at some of the news stories. And our news section begins with the launch of Sora 2. OpenAI's updated Sora AI video service has kicked off another round of anger, anxiety, and content creation among musicians, actors, writers, and other content creators. Sora is sort of an app, and the main utility of it seems to be, particularly in the free version, is that you can just type in a video prompt and for free get a video that is AI generated and often will integrate, for example, you into a scene from a movie. It's sort of the ultimate in fan fiction, that you can just see exactly what you want, or at least a passable simulacrum of what you want with some distortion. And obviously there is upset among people who think that this is coming for their lunch, and rage among people who feel like this is going to come for their lunch, but it shouldn't. I think the big fear is that it will become this sort of ultimate fan fiction generation machine where you see a movie and it doesn't give you exactly what you wanted. And so rather than going away and writing a story about it, you can enter into Sora the scenes that you would have liked to have seen differently. And I think it will do something for a certain segment of the population. I think it's the biggest threat that it has is actually to those big trying to please everyone blockbusters, because the nature of AI is that it is the lowest common denominator. It is the average of what everyone can imagine, and therefore it is deeply average. And so if it is going to come up after anyone, it's not after independent artists at all. It's after sort of studio slop and their absolute obsession with giving everyone a really blandified average of everything that they might possibly want without offending anybody. I feel like the reaction will be that there will be more interesting independent cinema made in reaction, but I could be wrong. I also think that people who fear it's coming for their jobs are probably wrong, because what it will do is suck away the the competition of people who are easily satisfied. So people who have a creative vision that is easily fulfilled by just typing a prompt in will no longer be competing with you in the market to get your work out there, because they'll be sitting at home generating short scenes and sending them to their uncle. But again, if you have a differing opinion, I would love to hear it. There is also in the first muscular Barbie has been launched, modeled after Ilona Ma, the rugby star. And I don't know how I feel about expressions of feminism that are manifested by giving you something to buy. Because I understand that like representation is important and it will shape the minds of young people. And so giving our daughters and sons a broad range of body types in their dolls is important. But I didn't watch the Barbie movie, even though people said it was really good, because I don't want good propaganda for a thing that I don't really approve of in the first place. And so I feel deeply mixed about the Ilona Ma Barbie, although I think if you are a rugby player and want your daughters to aspire to be rugby players, it's as good a way as any, I guess, of getting them into rugby. But I would say you're probably better off, taking your daughter out and playing rugby with her than you are buying her an Ilona Ma Barbie doll. It's just in time for International Day of the Girl, so I guess that's good. Your ad section now, because you can't be what you can't buy. Is your love life a series of misunderstandings that could be solved with a single honest conversation? Introducing The Conversation. This discreet, magically linked set of chairs facing each other allows for private real-time communication between two parties. Perfect for explaining why you danced with that Viscountess, clarifying your intentions before the third act, or simply sharing poetic thoughts without a scandal. Just listen to our happy customers. It saved me from a duel and secured me a happy marriage. 5 stars. Would recommend to any gentleman of fortune in want of a wife.
I was busy being an evil witch with rejection-sensitive dysphoria, but then I just spoke to the people of the village and we all agreed we didn't need to burn me alive, and now I work in the local library. Thanks, conversation.
Embrace the dawn, or at least don't burst into flames with Soliderm 5000. Soliderm 5000 is a non-greasy, fast-absorbing sun cream with an SPF of 5000. Developed by former Alchemist, it provides full-spectrum UVB/UV magic protection for up to 12 hours for any vampires or daywalkers with a headache. Finally, attend a daytime meeting, go to a picnic, or just get the newspaper. Soliderm 5000 can be backed up in an emergency by half a glass of water. And A Passion for Passion, my book, the scandalous book that if you saw and listened to last week's episode, it was available in your ears and also on YouTube. If you listened to last week's episode of Realms Unknown, you will know this book has been a scandal and a drama and a lot of trouble, but I have launched the audiobook, which you can buy now on all audiobook platforms or almost all audiobook platforms. Give it a check in a couple of days if it's not on your platform, but it's under the name A Passion for Passion. I read it. I wrote it. If that sounds like it's up your alley, check it out. And that brings me to, what have you been putting in your head this week? What have I been putting in my head? I went to the Brisbane Writers' Festival on Friday and I did a couple of panels. I was extremely starstruck. I've spent, like 20 years now doing comedy and I've never really been starstruck by a comedian. But I was sharing a panel with, or not quite a panel, an event. We had to write and read funny short stories with Garth Nix. Garth Nix, who wrote Sabriel and the Abortion series and the Left-Handed Booksellers of London. Actual Garth Nix was there reading a funny story. And then I was also reading a funny story like I'm the same kind of person as Garth Nix. And that was wildly exciting. Patrick Lenton, friend of the podcast, was there. And then we talked about comedy with Xiang Lu, who won the big prize in Australia, the big book prize. And then the next morning, Anne Summers gave a talk. Not the Anne Summers who sells bras and sex toys in the UK. Anne Summers who wrote Damned Whores and God's Police, which, although it is not a speculative fiction book, I think everyone should read. It's a book about the history and sociology of women in Australia and the ways in which, we built very consciously an idea of what women's role was in society, because we had first convicts, which was mainly male dominated, and then the female convicts came and started to form like brothels and cartels, and then there was a moral panic back in the UK and they sent gently bred young women over to Australia to be God's police. and tricked them into coming over with things like romance novels. And then it worked. So like social engineering to a wild degree, it's an amazing book. I mean, it's a thriller minute, very well researched history book about Australian history. But genuinely, I read it when I was like 13, and it changed the way that I see the world. And very luckily, it's now the 50th anniversary of the release of Damned Horse and God's Police. So Anne Summers was on stage giving a speech, and I got to see that. So that was extremely exciting to me. And I've been reading a lot of books and listening to a lot of books, but that has wiped them all out of my mind. So if you are running a writers' festival, turns out I love doing them. So please invite me, invite me to come along and do things. What else have I been listening to and reading? Martha Wells' Queen Demon. So Martha Wells, who wrote Murderbot, the Murderbot series, has also written this fantasy novel. It starts with Witch King, and then the sequel is Queen Demon, and it's set in a world where there's basically been a more or less apocalyptic conquest by these people called the Hierophants, and they just have such technological dominance, and they wipe out all of the major cities. And this is the story of the resistance as it succeeds and as it fails, more or less. And we see it from the perspective of Kaisteron, who is a demon prince. So there's an underworld, and demons can be invited into the bodies of sort of dying children in various tribes and places. And so they are demonic, but he's quite nice. And I've been enjoying it so far. It's a little bit in that way that those like 2000 heist movies, there's a lot of like stuff that we don't know that he knows, which I find quite difficult when you have a POV character who knows something that you don't know, but you're riding along in his head. I find that occasionally frustrating. So far, she's steered on the right side of keeping me on board. But yeah, it's maybe, I think it could lose me. We'll see. We'll see. And then also there's the sequel to The Last Soul Among Wolves, which I recommended as well. So it's a week of sequels for me. The Last Hour Between Worlds by Melissa Caruso. I recommended that in our Bringing Children Along for the Ride subgenre deep dive, because she has a fairly new baby and has to do the logistics of sort of babysitting and breastfeeding. And I really enjoyed that. So I went from Melissa Caruso to KJ Parker, 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City, which was recommended to me by our lovely gang of people who recommend things in our competence porn subgenre deep dive. So just do not think that your recommendations go unlistened to, because I've got an increasingly large to be read pile, and I managed to read 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City by KJ Parker, which was a lot of fun, but had an ending that I didn't expect. I think because the competence of the character was so satisfying, I found the ending unsatisfying, because it didn't end in a way that would have satisfied me. But it ended in a way that was like effective for the kind of grim, dark tone that it was going for, with sort of cynical tone. It made me think that a lot of grim, dark fantasy really likes competence, but the thesis of a lot of grimdark fantasy is that our sort of main protagonists are very competent and cynical, and so they are doing all these awful things, and that's the only way to operate in the world. And that, I feel like, inherently that's quite a sad idea of the world, that if you are competent, you must also be evil, because there's no way to get along in the world without being a cynical actor. I think maybe I don't like that. Because competence to me is inherently hopeful, maybe. The idea that something can be sorted out, but to have that you can only sort it out if you're willing to sort of knock someone's teeth out in order to get what you want, or cheat someone in order to get what you want. Those two things sit a little bit oddly, and maybe that's why I'm sort of alternately drawn to and then repelled by grimdark. But that brings us to Trope on a Rope. Each week we discuss a trope, a particular trope that we love to love or love to hate, but we certainly notice it every time we see it. My trope on a rope for this week is being able to cut a chain with a sword, where somebody has been captured and is chained up against a wall, and someone hits that chain with a sword or an axe, but it just pops the link and then they all escape, and then you can use the sword for anything again afterwards. Not my favorite. Generally, being able to get someone out of leg irons without a chisel and a hammer or a portable blacksmith is always puts up my like, wait a minute, head. But the swinging a sword and it managing to break a chain it's a lot for me, given that sort of the more my brother goes down YouTube rabbit holes about medieval weaponry, the more he tells me that swords are pretty useless for most things. I understand that, like, often it's done in slow motion, the big overhand swing of the sword, and then the link of the chain springs apart, and it's sort of a metaphor for justice or something. But I always, it's like when people drop a mic in some sort of to make a point. I always feel really sorry for the sound engineer, and I'm like, oh, that better be an SM58. And that brings us to our subgenre deep dive for the week, which is fan fiction, things that are written in tribute to other things. Now, every week we announce what the subgenre deep dive is going to be over on the Blue Sky and over on my Patreon, patreon.com/Alice Fraser or realms.unknown over at Blue Sky. We talk about what the subgenre deep dive is and we take your recommendations. Because this is a solo episode, I'm going to go through a fair few of the recommendations, but there is always a really long reading list from clever people. So if this is a genre that you enjoy or a subgenre that you enjoy, there's always more to read over there. I'm going to talk about where this subgenre idea came from and give a negative review, which I think might be the first negative review of this whole podcast, which is everybody's talking about it. SenLinYu's Alchemised, which is a dark, very dark academia, what is being called a romantasy, a direct transliteration of a Hermione Draco fanfiction called Manacled. So SenLinYu wrote it. They are a fanfiction author of some renown. This book has 26,588 ratings on Goodreads as of time of recording, and 7,221 reviews with a cumulative 4.61 rating. And it is a really bad book. I don't even know how else to say this. I think I disagree with it on a moral level. And I'm all for books that are like problematic. I'm not, I read Lolita, read like things that are going to make you upset and angry. But this book, I could not finish it. And I will read most things. One review sums up the book as having these tropes, which is one of the features of fan fiction that's moved into modern writing, particularly romance writing, where they list the tropes so that you can pick off a menu what kind of book you want to read. But this is a dark fantasy romance horror. It has alchemy and necromancy. It's post-war/wartime. It has morally grey main characters. It's a healer with a soldier/spy. Enemies to lovers. It's romance under extreme conditions. It's got non-descriptive spice. It's captor with captive. It's got imprisonment. It's got memory loss. It's got mystery. It's got espionage. It's got a non-linear narrative. It has wartime violence, religious abuse, depictions of complex trauma, suicidal ideation, self-harm, PTSD, medical torture, eugenics, cannibalism, sexual assault, rape, and allusion to necrophilia, and a happily ever after. And in case you're wondering if all of those things are, background color to an otherwise benevolent romance, they are not. They are integral to the characters' relationships with one another and the things that they witness one another being subjected to or doing or subject one another to. It is genuinely upsetting. People are loving it because it is very emotional. It's taking these characters right up to the edge of human tolerance and exploring the worst possible scenarios, and then sort of redeeming them by virtue of there being some passionate love or connection. And I find that so repugnant. I saw one of the reviews on Goodreads read, I love his character, meaning the Draco cipher, the chap who was originally meant to be Draco Malfoy and then translated into this character in Manacled in this alternate universe in which they wrote this and is now a different character. I love his character because it truly makes me wonder if someone commits atrocities to protect the one they love, can their actions ever be considered entirely evil? Yes. Yes, they fucking can. Like, as though anyone who's ever committed atrocities didn't have some reasoning or some emotion in their life. I don't often do a negative review, but I think on a writing level, what has happened is what might have been originally a well-written thing, whose kind of central argument I disagree with, has been rewritten to take out all identifiable features of the characters who are from Harry Potter. And then so the original thing took Hermione and Draco out of the Harry Potter universe and cast them in this alternate universe where there's this like necromancy and horrible abuse and Voldemort won. And they are in this like terrible functionally post-apocalyptic power thing. All of the most terrible people have won and are in power, essentially. But then has stripped all of the identifiable features and instead put in just a mishmash of different magic systems. And there is like necromancy, but the magic isn't Harry Potter magic because it can't be. And so it doesn't really all make sense. But then there's these characters that we refer to, like the shining golden boy of the revolution, who's clearly the Harry Potter stand-in, but we don't know that he's the Harry Potter stand-in. So he just doesn't really have a character. He's just everyone loved. Like it doesn't quite work as a translation from what it was originally, which was fan fiction. It doesn't really stand on its own unless you're importing the characters that you are familiar with and the fondness that you have for them. Yeah, I think for me it was a DNF, did not finish it, cannot recommend it. If it sounds like that's up your alley, real sort of torture and despair and sort of extreme wartime passion between an abuser and his victim, go ahead. But for things that are sort of fan fiction or fan fiction like that I can recommend, we have things like The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which is functionally taking a bunch of characters that already exist and putting them into a new scenario. Christopher Ruocchio's Sun Eater series is full of references, including things like an atomic blade, which could definitely cut through a chain, which is very clearly a lightsaber stand-in. It's got all of these fun references both to traditional arcs and traditional characters in science fiction and fantasy. He's clearly such a sci-fi and fantasy fan, and it's in his writing. And I really like and if you want a morally grey protagonist, the character there of Hadrian is a lot of fun to go with. Also a very effective version of the first person POV where we're in his head and there's things that he knows that we don't know, but that's very well done, or sort of very consciously done. So I can recommend the Sun Eater series by Christopher Ruocchio. There is an argument here in the comments section on Blue Sky that says, isn't every reboot, whether it's a book, comic, TV, streaming show or movie, fan fiction at heart? The idea that someone told a story, then someone else comes along and says, I like that story, or at least some element of it, and now I'm going to tell it my way, like kids playing with action figures. I think that is arguably true. I had an English lecturer that said, his name was Bruce Gardner. He was a brilliant lecturer, and he used to come in with a fistful of napkins with his lecture scrawled on them, and he'd speak a mile a minute and you'd just learn so much. But he would say that all language is quotation. So every word you hear in some context and then you translate it into other contexts, but it's all got the flavor of every place where you've heard it before, or every turn of phrase in the same way. All language is allusion. Everything is reference. So yes, to that extent, everything is fan fiction. But for the purposes of this subgenre deep dive, let's go into things that are actually might be classified as fan fiction. Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, surprisingly watchable, although By saying surprisingly watchable, I am breaking my rule of never recommending a film that you see on an aeroplane, because I think you cannot be objective about films that you see on aeroplanes because you're so grateful to not be staring at the back of a seat with nothing on it that you can't be objective. But I enjoyed Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, open brackets, caveat, semicolon, I saw it on a plane, close brackets. Robin in our comment section recommends the wonderful anthology License Expired, The Unauthorized James Bond. It was produced when the copyright of the James Bond novels expired in Canada. A lot of subversive stories, a couple with a speculative fiction bent. And that's by Madeline Ashby and David Nichol, which sounds like a lot of fun. The Unauthorized James Bond. That is now going on my to be read pile. In other recommendations, and these are over on my Patreon, we have Martin who says, surely all King Arthur stories are fanfic. That is true, definitely. Even the originals are probably fan fiction on oral stories that have been told and told. But this is a question maybe we need to make a distinction. Do we need to make a distinction between folklore and fan fiction? Whether there are things that belong in the realm of people all own them, or whether we need to, I mean, there is no copyright in an idea, and is a character an idea? It's interesting to ask that question. Certainly Mickey Mouse is copyrighted, or has just some versions of Mickey Mouse are now out of copyright. David in the comment section says, comics, especially superhero comics, are rife with references and fan fiction. Alan Moore has made a career of it. Looked at from a certain angle, Watchmen is fan fiction of Steve Ditko's Charlton Superheroes comics. His run on Supreme is Superman fan fiction, and arguably so is Tom Strong. He did a whole trilogy of graphic novels of H.P. Lovecraft fan fiction. Neonomicon, Providence, and the Courtyard, and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen might be the most ambitious work of fanfiction ever attempted. Paul Grist's Jack Staff creates a functioning and fun and exciting superhero world using a huge cast of barely veiled versions of various classic British comic characters like the Steel Claw and Janus Stark, as well as other British pop culture characters like Steptoe and Son. Alan Moore even turns up as Morlun the Mystic. Oh, and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles started out as Daredevil fanfiction, which is, I mean, I have no way of checking that, but that sounds amazing. I don't know enough about comic books, which is one of the reasons why I love these comment sections so much, because that feels like something, a rabbit hole I could go down. And Michael Fiffe's Copra, which is very explicitly fanfiction of John Ostrander's 1980s run on DC's Suicide Squad. It's incredible and an astonishing achievement. 50 issues, all written, drawn, colored, and lettered entirely by Fiffe over the course of just over a decade. He even self-published most of it. I cannot recommend it highly enough. So if you want to get into comic books and that arm of fanfiction, that feels like definitely a way to go. Of course, there's this big surge now for commissioning versions of fan fiction into real life that was pioneered basically by Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey, which steered it into the mainstream. And I feel like the current trend in romantasy is definitely riding the back of the things about fan fiction that people liked, which is this quite heavy reliance on tropes. There are characters who verge on what you would call Mary Sue's, sort of a lot of wish fulfillment fantasy in them, even though the things like A Court of Thorns and Roses embrace these sort of sprawling, vast, interlinked worlds and follow in the steps of people like Brandon Sanderson in making these worlds with many levels and layers and allusions to themselves. That I feel is also to some degree a fan fiction-y tendency, that you want everything to lock into everything else and to make sense with everything else and to be influencing and affecting everything else. It gives a really satisfying sense of that kind of conspiratorial thinking where everything knocks on from other things. Now, if you have any recommendations for things that are fan fiction or fan fiction like, or any thoughts about fan fiction, of course, hit us up over on the Blue Sky at realms.unknown or on the Patreon, patreon.com/Alice Fraser. To bring it back to me and my woes/victories, I feel like a passion for passion is definitely fan fiction like, because it talks about the things that I like about the genre, even though it's not specifically drawn from any particular character. It's sort of it is an AI amalgamation. If it were AI, it's a real intelligence amalgamation of all of the things that I've absorbed from these genres of romance and fantasy and romantasy. I think the genesis of the book was that I did a fan fiction competition of Dancy Lagarde literary tribute competition, and I got so many entries and they were so funny that I said to Chris Skinner, we could just publish that as a book. And then 2 steps along, when he was approached by the publishers who shall not be named because they no longer exist, they said, oh yeah, you could definitely do a Dancy Lagarde reader. It was originally going to be called the Dancy Lagarde Reader, and then we decided we could break the mainstream by making it more mainstream and calling it a Passion for Passion. If you want to make a Passion for Passion mainstream, please give it lots of nice reviews wherever you find it, and buy it in audiobook, the only place you could guarantee I'll see any of the money. But if you do have a copy, please buy it for someone for Christmas. That's allowed. That brings us to the end of this week's episode of Realms Unknown. Head over to a fanfiction watering hole and help yourself to some bizarro world fanfiction. I don't know what realms exist, but let me know if you find anything that's particularly good or particularly bad. I'm a big believer in bad art, and it's right to exist and our right to get pleasure from it. So this is a Bugle podcast and Alice Fraser production. Your editor is Ped Hunter. Your executive producer is Chris Skinner. And I'll talk to you again next week.